All right, how's everyone doing this evening? Tonight we are going to read through chapter 30 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. If you are new to watching this live with me, this is not just a regular reading. We are going to stop and talk about interesting vocabulary words or phrases of which you might not be familiar. So if you're watching this live, then I encourage you to ask questions in the chat, make comments. What's this? What's that? Because that's that's the point of reading it live, so you can ask questions. If you don't ask questions, then I will just stop sometimes and explain words that I think you probably don't know, or words that you might find useful, words or phrases you might find useful in regular life, or very frequently with Charles Dickens, words that I don't know, words that I don't understand. We'll stop and get the definition of some of these words. Well, let's get started with chapter 30 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which is called A Loss. I got down to Yarmouth in the evening and went to the inn. I knew that Peggotty's spare room, my room, was likely to have occupation enough in a little while, if that great visitor before whose presence all the living must give place were not already in the house. So I betook myself to the inn, and dined there, and engaged my bed. Davy is going to Yarmouth, just to recap what's happening in this chapter. His nursemaid, the woman who took care of him, the servant who took care of him when he was a baby, and he's very strongly attached to her. Her name is Peggotty, and her husband is dying. So when he heard about this, he went down to Yarmouth immediately to be with her. And normally he would stay in her home. She even has a special bedroom just for him, so that when he comes to visit, he can stay with her. Now, I'm not sure why, but he's saying that he knew that room would be occupied. I'm not sure if he's just saying he doesn't want to interfere and be there when her husband is dying, or if somebody is maybe somebody is staying in the room. I'm not really sure. But instead of staying with them, he got a hotel room. It was 10 o'clock when I went out. Many of the shops were shut, and the town was dull. Dull means boring, or nothing happening. When I came to the Omer and Joram's, I found the shutters up, but the shop door standing open, as I could obtain a perspective view of Mr. Omer inside, smoking his pipe by the parlor door. I entered and asked him how he was. This is the undertaker's store or establishment. An undertaker is a person who makes the preparations for somebody who has died. So making their clothes, making the box, which is called a coffin, or a casket to put them in. And Davy knows the undertaker because Davy was staying with Peggotty when his mother died, and he had to spend almost an entire day there when he was a boy. And he's visited them when he comes back because his best friend Emily had started working there. So he's very familiar with all the people in this shop, or in this establishment. It's not really a shop. "Why, bless my life and soul," said Mr. Omer. "How do you find yourself? Take a seat. Smoke not disagreeable, I hope?" "By no means," said I. "I like it. In somebody else's pipe." "What, not in your own, eh?" Mr. Omer returned, laughing. "All the better, sir. Bad habit for a young man. Take a seat. I smoke myself for the asthma." Mr. Omer is a very big, fat man who can hardly breathe, and he also, I guess, smokes a lot. Mr. Omer had made room for me, a place, and placed a chair. He now sat down again, very much out of breath. Out of breath means you can't breathe. That's out of breath. And gasping is gasping at his pipe, if it contained a supply of that necessary, without which he must perish. "I'm sorry to have heard the bad news about Mr. Barkis," said I. Mr. Omer looked at me with a steady countenance and shook his head. We've seen that word countenance before, and that just means the expression that you have on your face. So if he had a steady countenance, he didn't show any emotion. There was no expression on his face, because steady means doesn't change. "Do you know how he is tonight?" I asked. "The very question I should put to you, sir," returned Mr. Omer, "but on account of delicacy, it's one of the drawbacks of our line of business. When a party's ill, we can't ask how the party is." So, because he's the undertaker, he doesn't want to go around asking about people's health, because it looks like he's trying to get business. "How's your husband?" "Do you need my services yet?" So he says, we can't ask about people's health. I don't know how he's doing. Yes, you understand," said Mr. Omer, nodding his head. "We dursn't do it, bless you. It would be a shock that of that generality of parties mightn't recover. That dursn't do it. I think that's an old contraction for dare not do it. It would be a shock that the generality of parties mightn't recover to say, 'Omer and Joram's compliments, and how do you find yourself this morning, or this afternoon, as it may be?'" Mr. Omer and I nodded at each other, and Mr. Omer recruited his wind by aid of his pipe. "It's one of those things that cut the trade off from the attentions they could often wish to show," said Mr. Omer. "Take myself. If I have known Barkis a year, the move to as he went by, to move to, let me read that again. If I had known Mr. Barkis a year, to move to as he went by, I have known him 40 years, but I can't go and say, 'How is he?'" That's a weird sentence, but he's just saying, I've known Mr. Barkis a long time, but I can't ask how he's doing because of my profession. I felt it was rather hard on Mr. Omer, and I told him so. I'm not more self-interested, I hope, than another man," said Mr. Omer. "Look at me. My wind may fail me at any moment, and it ain't likely that, to my own knowledge, I'd be self-interested under such circumstances. I say, it ain't likely in a man who knows his wind will go, when it does go, as if a pair of bellows was cut open, that man a grandfather," said Mr. Omer. That's really hard to understand. "Look at me." I'm just going to read it again. "Look at me. My wind may fail me at any moment." So he's saying, look at me. Any moment I can stop breathing. "And it ain't likely, to my own knowledge, I'd be self-interested under such circumstances. I say it ain't likely in a man who knows his wind will go, when it does go, as if a pair of bellows was cut open, and that man a grandfather." Well, he says it's not likely that I would be self-interested. Maybe he's saying because I'm so close to death myself, why do I care? I don't want other people to die. I'm not interested in other people dying. I think we'll just have to accept that explanation. I said, not at all. "It ain't that I complain of my line of business," said Mr. Omer. "It ain't that. Some good and some bad goes, no doubt, to all callings. What I wish is that parties was brought up stronger-minded." Mr. Omer, with a very complacent and amiable face. Amiable means likable, and complacent means calm satisfied. Mr. Omer, with a very complacent and amiable face, took several puffs in silence, and then said, resuming his first point, accordingly, "We're obliged, in ascertaining how Barkis goes on, to limit ourselves to Emily." Oh, well, he says obliged, but that's obliged. So he's saying we have to ascertain, we have to find out how Barkis goes on by asking Emily. Remember, his friend, Davy's friend Emily, works there now. So they ask Emily, and that way they don't appear insensitive. She knows what our real objects are, and she don't have any more alarms or suspicions about us than if we was so many lambs. Minnie and Joram have just stepped down to the house. In fact, she's there, after hours, helping her aunt a bit, to ask her how he is tonight, and if you was to please to wait till they come back, they'd give you the full particulars. Will you take something? A glass of srub and water? What is srub? So he's saying Emily's going to come back pretty soon. You can ask her. Srub. What is srub? A drink of juice, fruit juice, and spirits or something. Okay, it's just some weird word for, do you want something to drink? "I smoke on srub and water myself," said Mr. Omer, taking up his glass, "because it's considered softening to the passages by which this troublesome breath of mine gets into action. But Lord bless you," said Mr. Omer huskily, "it ain't the passages that's out of order. Give me a breath enough," said I to my daughter Minnie, "and I'll find passages, my dear." He really had no breath to spare. If you have something to spare, that means you have something extra. If you have nothing to spare, that means you need every single bit. So if Davy says he really had no breath to spare, that means he had he didn't waste any air that he took in. He used it all. He needed it all. And it was very alarming to see him laugh. When he was again in a condition to be talked to, I thanked him for the proffered refreshment which I declined, as I had just had dinner, and observing that I would wait, since he was so good to invite me, until his daughter and his son-in-law came back, I inquired how little Emily was. "Well, sir," said Mr. Omer, removing his pipe, that he might rub his chin, "I tell you truly, I shall be glad when her marriage has taken place." "Why so?" I inquired. "Well, she's unsettled at present," said Mr. Omer. "It ain't that she's not as pretty as ever, for she's prettier. I do assure you she is prettier. It ain't that she don't work as well as ever, for she does. She was worth any 6, and she is worth any 6. But somehow she wants heart, if you understand." So that's kind of hard for me to understand myself, but I think he's saying that she doesn't seem happy. She doesn't seem enthusiastic. Mr. Omer, after rubbing his chin again and smoking a little, "What I mean in a general way by the expression a long pull, and a strong pull, and a pull altogether, my hearties, hurrah, I should say to you, that was, in a general way, what I miss in Emily." Yeah, I think that he's saying she seems depressed. Mr. Omer's face and manner went on for so much that I could conscientiously nod my head, as divining his meaning. My quickness of apprehension seemed to please him, and he went on. "Now, I consider this is principally on account of her being in an unsettled state, you see." So he thinks that the reason she's depressed or not very happy is because she needs to get married. We have talked it over a good deal. Her uncle and myself, and her sweetheart and myself, after business, and I consider it as principally on account of her being unsettled. You must always recollect of Emily, said Mr. Omer, shaking his head gently, that she's a most extraordinary affectionate little thing. The proverb says, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Well, I don't know about that. I rather think you may, if you begin early in life. She has made a home out of that old boat, sir, that stone and marble couldn't beat. I'm sure she has, said I. To see the clinging of that pretty little thing to her uncle, said Mr. Omer, to see the way she holds on to him, tighter and tighter, closer and closer, every day, is to see a sight. Now, you know there's a struggle going on when that's the case. Why should it be made a longer one than is needful? I listened attentively to the good old fellow and acquiesced with all my heart in what he said. Therefore, I mentioned to them, said Mr. Omer, in a more comfortable, easy-going tone, this, I said, now don't consider Emily nailed down in point of time at all. Make it your own time. Her services have been more valuable than was supposed. Her learning has been quicker than was supposed. Omer and Joram can run their pen through what remains, and she's free when you wish. If she likes to make any little arrangement afterwards in the way of doing any little thing for us at home, very well. If she don't, very well still. We're no losers anyhow. So Mr. Joram is saying she's committed to working here for a certain amount of time, but she's such a good worker, don't worry about that. Let's just get her married as soon as possible, and I don't care if she comes back. She's done enough work for us. She's been very good, so it's fine. And even if she wants to continue working, she can continue working from home. We can make that happen. But he thinks that if she gets married, she'll be much happier, and that's better for everybody. For don't you see, said Mr. Omer, touching me with his pipe, it ain't likely that a man so short of breath as myself, and a grandfather too, would go and strain points with a little bit of blue-eyed blossom like her. So he's saying, a grandfather like me, it ain't, I don't know, this is kind of weird. Let's see. Don't you see, said Mr. Omer, touching me with his pipe, it ain't likely that a man so short of breath as myself, and a grandfather too, would go and strain points. I'm not sure what that means, to strain points, with a little bit of blue-eyed blossom like her. To strain something means to filter or cause tension, something like that. To strain points? Let's see. I'm not sure what that means, to strain points. To depart from the usual procedure or rule. That's funny because it says that it's American English. I've never heard that expression, and this is British. So it's double weird. But it says to depart from the usual procedure or rule because of special circumstances. Well, that's strange because he said that he would be okay breaking the rules for her because he likes her. But then he's saying here, it ain't likely that a man so short of breath as myself, and a grandfather too. Well, maybe he's saying, she's so pretty that maybe a younger man would break the rules for her because, maybe he had some kind of hopes or something. But he's saying, I'm an old man. I'm about to die. I can't even breathe. I'm a grandfather. I'm not breaking the rules for her because she's pretty. I think that's what he's saying. It ain't likely that a man so short of breath as myself, and a grandfather too, would go and strain points with a little bit of blue-eyed blossom like her. Not at all, I'm certain, said I. Not at all, you're right, said Mr. Omer. Well, sir, her cousin, you know it's a cousin she's going to be married to. Oh, yes, I replied, I know him well. Of course you do, said Mr. Omer. Well, sir, her cousin, being, as it appears, in good work and well-to-do, thanked me in a very manly sort of manner for this, conducting himself altogether, I must say, in a way that gives me a high opinion of him, and went and took as comfortable a little house as you or I could wish to clap eyes on. That little house is now furnished right through, and neat and complete as a doll's parlor. But for Barkis's illness having taken this bad turn, poor fellow, they would have been man and wife, I dare say, by this time. As it is, there's a postponement. Well, it sounds like, I thought that they were going to live in the boat, but it sounds like Ham, the man that Emily's supposed to marry, has bought a house. And according to the undertaker, I forgot his name, Mr. Joram, I think? I don't know. Wellington Cardoso. Sorry, I didn't see you there. I just noticed your comment now. How are you doing tonight, Wellington? What does clinging mean? Actually, you know, I'm going to show you a picture. I know I have a picture here in my computer. Let me see if I can find it very quickly. So it sounds like Ham, Emily's future husband, has bought a nice house, and they were getting ready to be married when sorry, I'm looking for this picture now of Cling. I know I have it. I just forgot where it is. But because Peggotty's husband, Mr. Barkis, is dying, they've had to postpone their marriage, and that's why Mr. Joram thinks that Emily is depressed. But I think it's not. Cling. Oh, I can't find it. I thought I could find it very easily. Let's see. Oh, I did find it. Okay. Here, so let me show you this picture. Whoops, that's not right. This is cling. Clinging is holding onto something very tightly. So, cling, hold tightly. And actually, I can show you a useful picture here. Just a second. It's a very useful word. See, you can call this is called a lot of different things, but cellophane, plastic wrap, but also cling wrap. Cling wrap, because cling means holding on to something very tightly. So this is cling wrap. Okay. Let's get rid of this picture now. All right. So, and Emily, Mr. Omer, I inquired, has she become more settled? Why, that, you know, he returned, rubbing his double chin again, can't naturally be expected. The prospect The prospect of the change and separation and all that is, as one may say, close to her and far away from her, both at once. Barkis's death needn't put it off, but his lingering might. Anyway, it's an uncertain state of matters, you see. Oh boy, I have to read that again. Why, that, you know, he returned, rubbing his double chin, can't naturally be expected. The prospect of change and separation and all that is, as one may say, close to her and far away from her both at once. So the prospect of something means like the potential of something or the future happening of something. And he's saying she has the prospect of gaining things and losing things both at the same time, of separation and change. So Ham bought her this house. Now she's going to have to move to a new house away from her family. And that's pretty scary and depressing. But also Mr. Barkis is dying. That's another change. And getting married, that's also a big change. And it doesn't seem like Emily wants to marry him, actually. Although I don't think that Mr. Joram has noticed that. Or Mr. Omer. Sorry, Mr. Omer. I see, said I. Consequently, pursued Mr. Omer, Emily's still a little down. To be down means to be depressed, to be sad. So Emily's still a little down means Emily's a little depressed. And a little fluttered. Fluttering is like the movement of wings. Think about a butterfly fluttering their wings. This is fluttering. But to be fluttered, I don't know, maybe that means nervous. Perhaps upon the whole, she's more than she was. Every day she seems to get fonder and fonder of her uncle. To be fond of something means to like something. So every day she seems to get fonder and fonder of her uncle means every day she seems to like her uncle more. And more loth to part from us all. Maybe that means loathe. Maybe that's a misprint. More loathe. To loathe means to hate. So, and more to be loath to do something means to hate to do it. And more loath to part from all of us. So she's growing more scared of leaving all of her friends and family. A kind word from me brings the tears into her eyes. And if you was to see her with my daughter, Minnie's little girl, you'd never forget it. Bless my heart alive, said Mr. Omer, pondering how she loves that child. Having so favorable an opportunity, it occurred to me to ask Mr. Omer before our conversation should be interrupted by the return of his daughter and her husband, whether he knew anything of Martha. Ah, he rejoined, shaking his head and looking very much dejected. No good. A sad story, sir. I think Martha, I'm not sure who Martha is, but one night there was a girl who was very sad and depressed and crying, and she needed help. And they never said what the problem was, but I think she was pregnant, and she didn't have a husband, so she had no hope of doing anything or getting a job, or she was very scared. And Emily helped her. She gave her all of their money so that she could at least run away to London. And I think maybe that's Martha. Let's see. Ah, he rejoined, shaking his head and looking very much dejected. No good. A sad story, sir. However, you come to know it. I never thought there was harm in the girl. I wouldn't wish to mention it before my daughter Minnie, for she'd take me up directly, but I never did. None of us ever did. Mr. Omer, hearing his daughter's footstep, before I heard it, touched me with his pipe and shut up one eye, as a caution. She and her husband came in immediately afterwards. Their report was that Mr. Barkis was as bad could be, and that he was quite unconscious, and that Mr. Chillip had mournfully said in the kitchen on going away just now that the College of Physicians, the College of Surgeons, the Apothecaries' Hall, if they were all called in together, couldn't help him. He was past both colleges, Mr. Chillip said, and the hall could only poison him. Hearing this and learning that Mr. Peggotty was there, I determined to go to the house at once. I don't know why Davy didn't go to the house immediately. It doesn't make sense. I bade good night to Mr. Omer and to Mr. and Mrs. Joram, and directed my steps thither. Thither, that's not a word that people use anymore. That's an old word. It just means to there. So in modern English, you would say, I went there. But in older English, you would say, I went thither. You don't use it. Most people won't know what that means. And if they do know what it means, they'll be shocked that you're using it. With a solemn feeling which made Mr. Barkis quite a new and different creature. My low tap at the door was answered by Mr. Peggotty. He was not so much surprised to see me as I had expected. I remarked this in Peggotty, too, when she came down, and I've seen it since, and I think in the expectation of that dread surprise. To dread something is when you feel nervous and afraid, when you're waiting for something to happen, anticipating something to happen, and you know it's going to be horrible. So if you hate your job, when you go to work in the morning, you might feel this nervous, scared, horrible feeling because you know that going to work is going to be a bad experience. And you can say, every day I dread going to work. So dread is a verb, and it means I feel this horror, this pain, this sadness, because I know something horrible is going to happen. I think in the expectation of that dread surprise, all other changes and surprises dwindle into nothing. To dwindle means to diminish, to go down, to go from intense to not so intense, from intense to soft. I shook hands with Mr. Peggotty and passed into the kitchen, while he softly closed the door. Little Emily was sitting by the fire, with her hands before her face. Ham was standing near her. We spoke in whispers, listening between whiles for any sound in the room above. I had not thought of it on the occasion of my last visit, but how strange it was to me now that to miss Mr. Barkis out of the kitchen. I'm not sure what that means. I had not thought of it on the occasion of my last visit, but how strange it was to me now to miss Mr. Barkis out of the kitchen. This is very kind of you, Master Davy, said Mr. Peggotty. It's uncommon kind, said Ham. Emily, my dear, cried Mr. Peggotty, see here, here's Master Davy come. What, cheer up, pretty. Not a word to Master Davy? So Mr. Peggotty is saying, look, Davy came all the way from London to see us. Cheer up, act a little bit happy to see him. There was a trembling upon her. Trembling is small movements, like this is trembling. So maybe somebody who's trying not to cry will tremble. I can't do it, but maybe you get the idea. Oh, when people are trying not to cry, their lips tremble. It's like that small shaking movement. But this is actually, there was trembling upon her breast. So the trembling was in this area. "It's such a loving art," said Mr. Peggotty, smoothing her rich hair with his great hard hand. He's saying heart, but he doesn't pronounce H's. So he says, "It's such a loving art," said Mr. Peggotty, smoothing her rich hair with his great hard hand, "that it can't abear sorrer of this." That it can't abear the sorrer of this. I'm not sure what sorrer means here. "It's natural in young folk, Master Davy, when they're new to these here trials, and timid like my little bird. It's natural." So Mr. Peggotty is apologizing for Emily not speaking, because he's saying she's young, and this is a difficult situation. She doesn't know how to deal with it. It's perfectly normal that she's being a little bit rude. Oh, we have, remember you asked about cling, Wellington. Well, it's an irregular verb. So we have cling, clung. So she clung closer to him, but neither lifted up her face nor spoke a word. "It's getting late, my dear," said Mr. Peggotty, "and here's Ham come for to take you home. There, go along with t'other loving art." The other, I guess, is what that is. The other loving heart. "What, Emily? My pretty?" The sound of her voice had not reached me, but he bent his head as if he listened to her, and then said, "Let you stay with your uncle? Why, you don't mean to ask me that. Stay with your uncle, Moppet, when your husband, that'll be so soon, is here for you to take you home? Now a person would think of now a person wouldn't think of it, for to see this little thing alongside a rough-weathered chap like me." So Emily whispered in his ear, "Let me stay here with you." And he says, why do you want to stay with me, your uncle? You've got your future husband. He wants to walk you home. Go with him," said Mr. Peggotty, looking round at both of us with infinite pride. "But the sea ain't more salt in it than she has fondness in her for her uncle. A foolish little Emily." So he's saying, isn't that nice how much she loves me? "Emily's in the right in that, Master Davy," said Ham. "Looky here." It's funny because maybe this is like a weird regional thing, but it's very common, at least in North America. Instead of saying "look here," you say "looky here," which maybe is "look ye here." It just became "looky." That's very common when you're talking to someone and you tell them to look. Especially if you're having a conversation. Instead of saying "look here," you say "looky here." It's a pretty normal thing, actually. Even if you don't believe it. Let's see. I lost my place. I have to find it again. "Emily's in the right in that, Master Davy," said Ham. "Looky here." So he's just saying, "Look here, take a look. As Emily wishes of it, and she's hurried and frightened like besides. I'll leave her till morning. Let me stay too." No, said Mr. Peggotty. "You don't ought, a married man like you, or what's as good, to take and hull away a day's work, and you don't ought to watch and work both. That won't do. You go home and turn in. You ain't afeard of Emily not being took good care on, I know." So Ham is saying, okay, let Emily stay here, but I'm staying too. And Mr. Peggotty is saying, no, you're working too hard. You have to work tomorrow morning also. You can't stay up all night waiting for Mr. Barkis to die. You have to get a nice, comfortable rest. Go home. And it's okay if Emily stays here. You trust us, don't you? I'm her uncle. Ham yielded to this persuasion and took his hat to go, even when he kissed her, and I never saw him approach her. But I felt that nature had given him the soul of a gentleman. She seemed to cling closer to her uncle, even to the avoidance of her chosen husband. I shut the door after him, and it might cause no disturbance of the quiet that prevailed, and when I turned back, I found Mr. Peggotty still talking to her. "Now, I'm a-goin' upstairs to tell your aunt as Master Davy's here, and that'll cheer her up a bit," he said. "Sit ye down by the fire, and while, my dear, and warm those mortal cold hands. You don't need to be so fearsome and take on so much, what? You'll go along with me? Well, come along with me, come." If her uncle was turned out of the house and home and forced to lay down in a dyke, Master Davy said, Mr. Peggotty, with no less pride than before, "It's my belief she'd go along with him. Now, but there'll be someone else soon, Emily." So, Mr. Peggotty wants to go upstairs and let Peggotty know that Davy is here. And he tells Emily to wait. But she wants to go with him, which is kind of strange. But Mr. Peggotty is saying, if I were homeless tomorrow and had to sleep in the streets, Emily would want to come along with me. So that's how much she loves her uncle. Afterwards, when I went upstairs, as I passed the door of my little chamber, which was dark, I had an indistinct impression of her being within it, cast down upon the floor. But whether it was really she, or whether it was a confusion of the shadows in the room, I don't know. I think he's talking about Emily. So Davy's going up to see Peggotty and Mr. Barkis, who's dying, and along the way he passes his bedroom, or what Peggotty keeps as his bedroom. And it was dark inside, but he had the sense that there was somebody on the floor in that room, in his room. And I think he thinks it was Emily. I had leisure to think before the kitchen fire of pretty little Emily's dread of death, which added to what Mr. Omer had told me. I took to be the cause of her being so unlike herself, and I had leisure before Peggotty came down, even to think more leniently of the weakness of it, as I sat counting the ticking of the clock, and deepening my sense of the solemn hush around me. Peggotty took me in her arms and blessed and thanked me over and over again for being such a comfort to her. And that was what she said in her distress. She then entreated me. Entreating means like begging. Please, please. She then entreated me to come upstairs, sobbing. Sobbing is very loud, crying. Sobbing that Mr. Barkis had always liked me and admired me, and that he had often talked of me before he fell into a stupor. A stupor is like a strange, maybe like half awake, half asleep, not very aware of what is happening around you. If you drink a lot of alcohol, you could be in a drunken stupor, and that means you're not really aware of the world around you. But Mr. Barkis is not drunk. He's very sick and about to die. So he's in this very strange space. He's in a stupor. and that she believed in a case of his coming to himself again, he would brighten up at the sight of me, if he could brighten up at any earthly thing. The probability of his ever doing so appeared to me when I saw him to be very small. He was lying with his head and shoulders out of bed, in an uncomfortable attitude, half resting on a box which had cost him so much pain and trouble. I learned that when he was past creeping out of bed to open it, and past assuring himself of its safety by means of divining rod I had seen him use. I learned that when he was past creeping out of bed to open it, and past assuring himself of its safety by means of his divining rod I had seen him used, he had required to have it placed on the chair at the bedside, where he had ever since embraced it night and day. Mr. Barkis is a very quiet man. He doesn't say very many words. And so when Peggotty married him, and Davy went to go visit them finally in their home, he had discovered that Mr. Peggotty was a miser. A miser is someone who refuses to spend money. They just get money and they keep it to themselves, and they never like to spend. He's a very nice man. Mr. Barkis is a very, very nice man, but he's very paranoid about money, and he doesn't like to spend any money. So he keeps all of his money in this box, which is always next to his bed. And when he could walk, he could go and inspect his money whenever he wanted. And when he became sicker, he would use a stick to lift up the box and check his money. But when he became so sick that he couldn't really move anymore, he demanded to have his box right next to him always. So he's laying in this stupor, about to die, hugging his money box. He's not a bad man or a greedy man, but he's just very paranoid about his money. His arm lay on it now. Time and the world was slipping from beneath him, but the box was there, and the last words he had uttered were, in an explanatory tone, "Old clothes." So Mr. Barkis, he thought he was tricking everyone, and he never said that his money was in the box. He would just say that there were old clothes in the box. Everyone knew that he kept his money there, but nobody ever touched it. And he always insisted, "You see that box over there? That's just some old clothes." So his last words while he was hugging his box were, "Old clothes." And then he died. "Barkis, my dear," said Peggotty, almost cheerfully bending over him, while her brother and I stood at the bed's foot. "Here's my dear boy, Master Davy, who brought us together, Barkis, that you sent messages by. You know, won't you speak to Master Davy?" He was as mute and senseless as the box from which his form derived the only expression it had. "He's a-going out with the tide," said Mr. Peggotty to me, behind his hand. My eyes were dim, and so were Mr. Peggotty's, but I repeated in a whisper, "With the tide?" "People can't die along the coast," said Mr. Peggotty, "except when the tide's pretty nigh out. They can't be born." "Unless it's pretty nigh in, not properly born, till flood. He's a-going out with the tide. It's ebb at half order 3. Slack water, half an hour. If he lives till it turns, he'll hold his own till past the flood and go out with the next tide." Okay, well, Mr. Peggotty has a pretty regional way of expressing his thoughts. It's kind of hard to explain. But he's a fisherman, so he has these superstitions Let me get a picture here. The tide is the movement of water, not waves. But, sometimes, at some periods during the day, the water goes very far out, and that's the tide going out. And when the tide comes in, that's the water going in. So Mr. Peggotty is a superstitious fisherman, and he says that he won't die until the tide goes out, because people only die when the tide goes out, and babies can only be born when the tide comes in. That's his superstition. We remained there, watching him, a long time, hours. What mysterious influence my presence had upon him in the state of his senses, I shall not pretend to say, but when he at last began to wander feebly, it was certain he was muttering about driving me to school. "He's coming to himself," said Peggotty. Mr. Peggotty touched me and whispered with much awe and reverence, "They're both a-going out fast." "Barkis, my dear," said Peggotty. "C.P. Barkis," he cried faintly, "no better woman anywhere." "Look, here's Master Davy," said Peggotty, for he now opened his eyes. I was on the point of asking him if he knew me, when he tried to stretch out his arm and said to me distinctly, with a pleasant smile, "Barkis is willin'." And it being low water, he went out with the tide. Okay, well, that was chapter 30. That was kind of short, so I think we can do another chapter, but I just have to take a break, and then we'll read chapter 31. I hope it's not a really long chapter, but I hope you stick around, and we'll do chapter 31 in a minute. Just let me take a little break. 1 minute break. Okay. Oh no, it's blurry. That's better. All right, well, let's keep going with chapter 31, A Greater Loss. It was not difficult for me, on Peggotty's solicitation, to resolve to stay there, where I was until after the remains of the poor carrier should have made their last journey to Blunderstone. She had long ago bought, out of her own savings, a little piece of ground on our old churchyard, near the grave of her sweet girl, and she always called my mother, and there they were to rest. Okay, so in case you don't know, or in case you don't remember, Barkis was like a bus driver. And his job was he had a horse and a cart, and he would carry people from where Davy was born, Blunderstone. I'm not sure if that's the name of the town. Maybe it is the name of the town. To Yarmouth. And so in his various travels, he would always see Peggotty, and Barkis used Davy to hook them up together to get married. So Davy's the one who brought Barkis and Peggotty together. And when Davy's mother died, and Peggotty moved to Yarmouth, and Davy went on to go live his life, Peggotty bought some land in the same place where Davy's mother is buried. And that is where they buried Barkis. And so they're saying this is his final trip to Blunderstone. He used to travel that every day, taking people to and from Yarmouth. In keeping Peggotty company, and doing all I could for her, little enough at the utmost, I was as grateful, I rejoice to think, as even now I could wish myself to have been. But I am afraid that I had a supreme satisfaction of a personal and professional nature in taking charge of Mr. Barkis's will and expounding its contents. I may claim the merit of having originated the suggestion that the will should be looked for in the box. After some search, it was found in the box, and at the bottom of the horse's nose bag, wherein, besides hay, there was discovered an old gold watch, with chain and seals, which Mr. Barkis had worn on his wedding day, and which had never been seen before or since, a silver tobacco stopper in the form of a leg, an imitation lemon full of minute cups and saucers, which I have some idea Mr. Barkis must have purchased to present to me when I was a child, and afterwards found himself unable to part with it. 87 guineas and a half, and guineas and half guineas, 210 pounds in perfectly clean banknotes, and certain receipts for Bank of England stock, an old horseshoe, a bad shilling, a piece of camphor, an oyster shell, from the circumstance of the latter article having been much polished and displaying prismatic colors on the inside. I conclude that Mr. Barkis had some general ideas about pearls, which never resolved themselves into anything definite. For years and years, Mr. Barkis had carried this box on all his journeys, every day, that it might the better escape notice. He had invented a fiction that it belonged to Mr. Blackboy, and was to be left with Barkis till called for. A fable he had elaborately written on the lid, in characters now scarcely legible. So Mr. Barkis carried his chest full of money everywhere he went, and he made a story. Because people probably noticed that he always had this box with him. He said, "Oh, somebody left that, and I just have to keep it until he returns." And he even went so far as to write that story on top of the box. But that was such a long time ago that you really couldn't read it anymore. He had hoarded all these years, I found, to good purpose. His property and money amounted to nearly 3,000 pounds. That's a lot of money, I think, in... Well, let's see, what is the equivalent of that now? That might be like 300,000 pounds now. Let's see. Oh, no. Let's see. Let's see. How much was £1 in 1840? So that's like 80 pounds now. So 100, yeah, it's like 300,000 pounds. Very close to it. Not exactly. That's a lot of money. Peggotty's rich. Let's see. Of this, he bequeathed the interest of 1,000 to Mr. Peggotty for his life. So Mr. Barkis gave Peggotty's brother £1,000. Or the interest. On his decease, the principal to be equally divided between Peggotty, little Emily, and me. Or the survivor of survivors of us, share and share alike. All the rest he died possessed of, he bequeathed to Peggotty, whom he left residuary legatee and sole executrix of his last will and testament. I felt myself quite a proctor when I read this document aloud with all possible ceremony and set forth its provisions any number of times to those whom they concern. So Davy's feeling very adult and grown up because he's training to be a lawyer, and now he's reading the official will of Mr. Barkis, and he knows just how to do it and what it means, and he's very proud of his delivery of the will. I examined the will with the deepest attention, pronounced it perfectly formal in all respects, and made a pencil mark or so in the margin, and thought it rather extraordinary that I knew so much. In this abstruse pursuit, and making an account for Mr. Peggotty of all the property into which she had come, in arranging all the affairs in an orderly manner, and in being her referee and adviser on every point to our joint delight, I passed the week before the funeral. I did not see little Emily in the interval, but they told me that she was to be quietly married in a fortnight. I did not attend the funeral in character, if I may venture to say so. I mean, it was not dressed up in black coat and streamer to frighten the birds, but I walked over to Blunderstone early in the morning, and was in the churchyard when it came, attended only by Peggotty and her brother. The mad gentleman looked on, out of my little window. Mr. Chillip's baby wagged its heavy head and rolled its goggle eyes. And the clergyman, over its nurse's shoulder, Mr. Omer, breathed short in the background. No one else was there, and it was very quiet. We walked about the churchyard for an hour, after all was over, and pulled some young leaves from the tree above my mother's grave. A dread falls on me here. A cloud is lowering on the distant town towards which I retraced my solitary steps. I fear to approach it. I cannot bear to think of what did come upon that memorable night, of what must come again if I go on. It's no worse because I write of it. I would be no better if I stopped my most unwilling hand. It is done. Nothing can undo it. Nothing can make it otherwise than it was. My old nurse was to go to London with me next day on the business of the will. Little Emily was passing that day at Mr. Omer's. We were all to meet in the old boat-house that night. Ham would bring Emily at the usual hour. I would walk back at my leisure. The brother and sister would return as they had come, and be expecting us when the day closed in at the fireside. I parted from them at the wicket gate, where visionary Strap had rested with Roderick Random's knapsack in the days of yore. I have no idea what he's talking about here. I think he's talking about characters in a book that he was reading when he was younger. But I don't remember the reference. Maybe he referred to it earlier in the book, but I don't remember. Then I walked a little distance on the road to Lowestoft. Then I turned and walked back towards Yarmouth. I stayed to dine at a decent alehouse, some mile or two from the ferry I have mentioned before. And thus the day wore away. And it was evening when I reached it. Rain was falling heavily by that time, and it was a wild night. But there was a moon behind the clouds, and it was not dark. I was soon within sight of Mr. Peggotty's house, and the light within it shining through the window. A little floundering across the sand, which was heavy, brought me to the door, and I went in. It looked very comfortable indeed. Mr. Peggotty had smoked his evening pipe, and there were preparations for some supper by and by. And the fire was bright, the ashes were thrown up, the locker was ready for little Emily in her old place. In her own old place sat Peggotty once more, looking, but for her dress, as if she had never left it. She had fallen back already on the society of the work-box with St. Paul's upon the lid. That's her sewing kit. So she keeps all of her materials for sewing in a box that has a picture of St. Paul's Cathedral on it. So, and Davy's saying, besides wearing all black because her husband just died, everything seemed normal. She was just sitting there by the fire working. The yard measure in the cottage, and a bit of wax candle, and there they all were, just as if they had never been disturbed. Mrs. Gummidge appeared to be fretting a little in her old corner, and consequently looked quite natural too. "You're the first of the lot, Master Davy," said Mr. Peggotty with a happy face. "Don't keep it in that coat, sir, if it's wet." Don't keep in that coat, sir, if it's wet. So Mr. Peggotty is telling Davy to take off his coat. "Thank you, Mr. Peggotty," said I, giving him my outer coat to hang up. "It's quite dry." "So 'tis," said Mr. Peggotty, feeling my shoulders, "as a chip. Sit ye down, sir. It ain't no use saying welcome to you, but you're welcome, kind and hearty." "Thank you, Mr. Peggotty. I'm sure of that." "Well, Peggotty," said I, giving her a kiss, "and how are you, old woman?" "Ha, ha," laughed Mr. Peggotty, sitting down beside us and rubbing his hands in his sense of relief from a recent trouble. And in the genuine heartiness of his nature, "There's not a woman in the world, sir, as I tell her, that need to feel more easy in her mind than her. She done her duty by the departed, and the departed knowed it, and the departed done what was right by her, and she done what was right by the departed, and it's all right." So Mr. Peggotty is saying, Peggotty's got nothing to worry about. She was a good wife, and her husband knew that, and he took very good care of her, so she's got no worries for the rest of her life. Mrs. Gummidge groaned. Groaning is "oh." So Mrs. Gummidge groaned. "Cheer up, my pretty mother," said Mr. Peggotty, but he shook his head aside at us, evidently sensible to the tendency of the late occurrences to recall the memory of the old one. "Don't be down. Cheer up, for your own self, only a bit, and see if a good deal more don't come natural." So Mrs. Gummidge is always depressed. She's a very sad woman. And so Mr. Peggotty is saying, "Cheer up," but then he's shaking his head, knowing she'll never cheer up. She's always depressed. He's saying, "Try to cheer up a little, unnaturally, and maybe the rest will come naturally to you. Not to me, Daniel, returned Mrs. Gummidge. No thing's natural to me but to be lone and lorn. So Mrs. Gummidge is saying, I could never be happy. The only thing natural to me is to be alone and sad. She's always like that. No, no, said Mr. Peggotty, soothing her sorrows. Yes, yes, Daniel, said Mrs. Gummidge. I ain't a person to live with them as has had money left. Things go too contrary with me. I had better be a riddance. So she's a widow, and I think that her husband couldn't leave her anything when he died. Mr. Peggotty takes care of her. Mr. Peggotty takes care of a lot of people. That's what he does. And so she had nowhere to go, and she would be out in the street if he didn't take care of her. And maybe she's a little bit jealous that Mr. Barkis left Peggotty so much money. And she's saying, I had better be a riddance, meaning, you know, maybe you've seen get rid of something, means like eliminate something, make something go away. And she's saying, I had better be a riddance. It's better if I just go away. Why? How should I ever spend it without you? Said Mr. Peggotty with an air of serious remonstrance. What are you talking on? Don't I want you more now than I ever did? I knowed I was never wanted before, cried Mrs. Gummidge, with a pitiable whimper. And now I'm told so. How could I expect to be wanted, being so lone and lorn and so contrary? Well, I think maybe she's angry because Mr. Barkis didn't leave her any money, which is weird. Why would he ever leave her any money? But it seems like that she's a little bit jealous that he left Mr. Peggotty money, but not her. They weren't friends. Mr. Peggotty seemed very much shocked at himself for having made a speech capable of this unfeeling construction, but was prevented from replying by Peggotty's pulling his sleeve and shaking her head. After looking at Mrs. Gummidge for some moments, in sore distress of mind, he glanced at the Dutch clock, rose, snuffed the candle, and put it in the window. There, said Mr. Peggotty cheerily. There we are, Mrs. Gummidge. Mrs. Gummidge slightly groaned, lightened up according to custom. You're a wondering what that's fur, sir? Well, it's for our little Emily, you see. The path ain't over the light. The path ain't over light or cheerful after dark. And when I'm here at the hour as she's coming home, I puts the light in the winder. That, you see, said Mr. Peggotty, bending over me with great glee, meets two objects. She says Emily, there's home, she says, and likewise, says Emily, my uncle's there, for if I ain't here, I never had no light showed. So Mr. Peggotty is putting a candle in the window so that Emily can find the house because it's very dark. Well, returned Mr. Peggotty, standing with his legs pretty wide apart, rubbing his hands up and down them in his comfortable satisfaction as he looked alternately at us and at the fire. I don't know, but I am not, you see, to look at. Not exactly, observed Peggotty. No, laughed Mr. Peggotty, not to look at, but to consider on, you know. I don't care, bless you. Now I tell you, when I go a-looking and looking about that their pretty house of Emily's, I'm gormed, said Mr. Peggotty with sudden emphasis. Oh, this is really hard. But he's talking, from what I can understand, he's talking about being very happy to see Emily's new home that she's going to be living in after she gets married to Ham. I can't say more if I don't feel as if it's the littlest thing was her a most. I takes 'em up, I put 'em down, I touches 'em as delicate as if they were our Emily. So 'tis with her little bonnets, and that I couldn't see one on 'em rough used a purpose, not for the whole world. There's a babby for you in the form of a great sea porcupine, said Mr. Peggotty, relieving his earnestness with a roar of laughter. Oh gosh. I really don't understand what's going on in that paragraph, but, well, let's just continue. Peggotty and I both laughed, but not so loud. In my opinion, you see, said Mr. Peggotty with a delighted face after some further rubbing of his legs, as this is along of my having played with her so much, and made believe she was Turks and French and sharks and every variety of foreigners, bless you, yes, and lions and whales and I don't know what all. When she weren't no higher than my knee, I got into the way on it, you know. Why, this here candle now, said Mr. Peggotty gleefully, holding out his hand towards it. I know very well that after she's married and gone, I shall put that candle there just as the same as now. I know very well that when I'm here all nights, and where else should I live, bless your arts, whatever fortune I come into, and she ain't here, or I ain't there, I shall put a candle in the winder, and sit afore the fire, pretending I'm expecting her, like I'm doing now. So he put the candle in the window, and he said, the reason I do this is because it's very dark, and this way when Emily is coming home, she can see the house very easily. And he's saying, I know that when she gets married, I will continue to do that every night. There's a babby for you, said Mr. Peggotty with another roar, in the form of a sea porcupine. He's saying there's a baby for you in the form of a sea porcupine. I don't even know if that's a real thing, a sea porcupine. But he's saying it in a very kind of funny way. But I don't get the joke. I don't understand the joke. Okay. This is a sea porcupine, but he calls it a porcupine. And he's making some kind of joke, but I don't understand it, to be honest. But Peggotty and Davy think it's very funny, whatever it is. There's a babby for you, said Mr. Peggotty with another roar, in the form of a sea porcupine. Why, at the present minute, when I see the candles sparkle up, I says to myself, she's looking at it. Emily's a-comin'. There's a babby for you in the form of a sea porcupine. Right for all that, said Mr. Peggotty, stopping in his roar and smiting his hands together. For here she is. It was only Ham. The night should have turned more wet since I came in, for he had a large southwester hat on, slouched over his face. Where's Emily? Said Mr. Peggotty. Ham made a motion with his head, as if she were outside. Mr. Peggotty took the light from the window, trimmed it, put it on the table, and was busily stirring the fire, when Ham, who had not moved, said, Master Davy, will you come out a minute and see what Emily and me has got to show you? We went out. I passed him at the door, and I saw, to my astonishment and fright, that he was deadly pale. He pushed me hastily into the open air and closed the door upon us. Only upon us two. Ham, what's the matter? Master Davy. Oh, for his broken heart, how dreadfully he wept. I was paralyzed by the sight of such grief. I don't know what I thought, or what I dreaded. I could only look at him. Ham, poor good fellow, for heaven's sakes, tell me what's the matter. My love, Master Davy, the pride and hope of my art, her that I love, her that I have died for, and would die for now. She's gone. Gone? Emily's run away. Oh, Master Davy, think how she's run away, when I pray my good and gracious God to kill her. Her that is so dear above all things, sooner than let her come to ruin and disgrace. The face he turned up to the troubled sky, the quivering of his clasped hands. Quivering is this kind of movement. It's like trembling. It's like another word for trembling. The agony of his figure remain associated with the lonely waste in my remembrance to this hour. It is always night there, and he is the only object in the scene. You're a scholar, he said hurriedly, and know what's right and best. What am I to say indoors? How am I ever to break it to him, Master Davy? I saw the door move, and instinctively tried to hold the latch on the outside to gain a moment's time. It was too late. Mr. Peggotty thrust forth his face, and never could I forget the change that came upon it when he saw us. If I were to live 500 years, I remember a great wail and cry. Wailing is like, ah! It's like a very loud, screaming, crying. I remember a great wail and cry, and the women hanging about him, and we all standing in the room, I with a paper in my hand, which Ham had given me, Mr. Peggotty with his vest torn open, his hair wild, his face and lips quite white, and blood trickling down his bosom. It had sprung from his mouth, I think, looking fixedly at me. "Read it, sir," he said, in a low, shivering voice. "Slow, please. I don't know as I can understand." In the midst of the silence of death, I read thus from a blotted letter. "When you, who love me so much better than I have ever deserved, even when my mind was innocent, see this, I shall be far away. I shall be fur away," he repeated slowly. "Stop, Emily, fur away. Well, when I leave my dear home, oh, my dear home in the morning." The letter bore the date on the previous night. "It will never come back unless he brings me back, a lady. This will be found at night, many hours after, instead of me. Oh, if you knew how my heart is torn. If even you, that I have wronged so much, that never can forgive me, could only know what I suffer. I am too wicked to write about myself. Oh, take comfort in thinking that I am so bad. Oh, for mercy's sake, tell Uncle that I never loved him half so dear as now. Oh, don't remember how affectionate and kind you have all been to me. Don't remember we were ever to be married, but try to think as if I died when I was little and was buried somewhere. Pray heaven that I am going away. Have compassion on my uncle. Tell him that I never loved him half so dear. Be his comfort. Love some good girl that will be what I once was, what I was once to Uncle, and be true to you, and worthy of you, and no shame but me. God bless all. I pray for all often on my knees. If he don't bring me back a lady, and I don't pray for my own self, I shall pray for all. My parting love to Uncle, my last tears, my last thanks for Uncle. That was all. He stood long after I had ceased to read, still looking at me. At length I ventured to take his hand, and to entreat him, as well as I could, to endeavor to get some command of himself. And he replied, I thank ye, sir, I thank ye, without moving. Ham spoke to him. Mr. Peggotty was so far sensible of his affliction that he wrung his hand. To wring your hands is like this. No. But otherwise he remained in the same state, and no one dared disturb him. Slowly, at last, he moved his eyes from my face, as if he were waking from a vision, and cast them round the room, and then he said in a low voice, Who's the man? I want to know his name. Ham glanced at me, and suddenly I felt a shock that struck me back. There's a man suspected, said Mr. Peggotty. Who is it? Master Davy, implored Ham. Go out a bit, and let me tell him what I must. You don't ought to hear it, sir. I felt the shock again, and I sank down in the chair, and tried to utter some reply, but my tongue was fettered, and my sight was weak. I want to know his name, I heard said once more. For some time past, Ham faltered, there's been a servant about here at odd times. There's been a gentleman, too. Both of 'em belong to one another. Mr. Peggotty stood fixed as before, but now looking at him. The servant, pursued Ham, was seen along with our poor girl last night. He's been in hiding about here this week or over. He was thought to have gone, but he was hiding. Don't stay, Master Davy, don't. I felt Peggotty's arm round my neck, but I could not have moved if the house had been about to fall upon me. A strange chay and horses was outside town, and this morning, I think that means a stray carriage with horses. On the Norwich Road, a'most afore the daybreak, Ham went down. The servant went to it, and come from it, and went to it again, and when he went to it again, and Emily was nigh him, and the other was inside. He's the man. For the Lord's love, said Mr. Peggotty, falling back, putting out his hand as if to keep off what he dreaded, don't tell me his name's Steerforth. Master Davy, exclaimed Ham in a broken voice, it ain't no fault of yourn, and I'm far from laying of it to you, but his name is Steerforth, and he's a damned villain. Mr. Peggotty uttered no cry, and shed no tear, and moved no more, until he seemed to wake again all at once, and pulled down his rough coat from its peg in a corner. Bear a hand with this. I'm struck of a heap, and can't do it, he said impatiently. Bear a hand and help me. Well, when somebody had done so. Now give me that there hat. So Mr. Peggotty is telling, help me get on my coat and give me my hat. So he's going out, probably, to try and find Emily. I'm going to seek my niece. I'm going to seek my Emily. I'm going first to stave in that there boat and sink it where I would have drowned him, as I'm a living soul, if I had one thought of him, of what was in him. One time Steerforth came with Davy to spend some time in Yarmouth, and he had a wonderful time. He enjoyed it so much that he bought a boat because he enjoyed going out and fishing. But he really couldn't use the boat for anything, so he gave it to Mr. Peggotty to use for fishing. But now Mr. Peggotty is saying the first thing I'm going to do is sink that boat. And if I had ever known what would come of all of this, I would have drowned Steerforth too, if I had the chance. So he's going out to find his niece, but first he's going to destroy that boat. As I'm a living soul, if I had one thought of what was in him, as he sat afore me, he said, wildly holding his clenched right hand. Clench means like to have your hand in a fist, like ready to hit someone. But I'd have drowned him, and thought it right. I'm going to seek my niece. Where? Cried Ham, interposing himself before the door. Anywhere. I'm going to seek my niece through the world. I'm going to find my poor niece in her shame. I'm going to bring her back. No one stop me. I tell you, I'm a-going to seek my niece. No, no, cried Mrs. Gummidge, coming between them in a fit of crying. No, Daniel, not as you are now. Seek her in a little while, my lone, lorn Daniel, and that'll be but right, but not as you are now. Sit ye down, and give me your forgiveness for having ever been a worry to you. Daniel, what have my contraries ever been to this? And let us speak a word about them times when she was first an orphan, and when Ham was too, and when I was a poor widder woman, and you took me in. It'll soften your poor heart, Daniel, laying her head upon his shoulder, and you'll bear the sorrow better. For you know the promise, Daniel, as you have done it unto one of the least of these, you have done unto me. And that can never fail under this roof that's been our shelter for so many a year. So Mrs. Gummidge, who is always depressed and always in a bad mood, is saying, no, you can't go out in this state, the way that you are, so angry. And she's saying, I'm sorry for all the bother I've ever been to you, and you're such a wonderful person. You took care of Ham when he had nowhere to go. You took care of Emily when she had nowhere to go. And you took care of me when I had nowhere to go. Now let us take care of you, and listen to me, and don't go now. He was quite passive now, and when I heard him crying, the impulse that had been upon me to go down upon my knees and ask their pardon for dissolution I had caused, and the curse of Steerforth, yielded to a better feeling. My overcharged heart found the same relief, and I cried too. Okay, well, that was the end of chapter 31 of David Copperfield. I think we'll stop there for tonight. And next time we'll start with chapter 32, the beginning of a long journey. And thank you for everyone who stayed and watched tonight, and thank you for your questions. I hope you come back when we read chapter 32. We'll probably do it tomorrow night. We'll have to see, but I think probably tomorrow night. So I hope you come back tomorrow for chapter 32. Goodbye.